There is something deeply unsettling about the idea of being completely alone. Not for a day, not for a week, but for years, decades even. The human mind was built for connection, for conversation, for the simple presence of another person in a room. But what happens when all of that is stripped away? What happens when the only voice you hear is your own, and even that starts to feel foreign? The stories you're about to hear are about people who found out, whether by choice, by duty, or by force. In the spring of 1986, a 20-year-old man named Christopher Thomas Knight made a decision that, by any reasonable standard, should not have been possible. He had just finished an electronics course at Sylvania Technical School and had taken a job installing home alarm systems in Waltham, Massachusetts. It was steady work, a respectable beginning for a young man from Albion, Maine. He had 4 older brothers and a younger sister. His parents were by all accounts decent people, if not especially affectionate. The Knights were stoic New Englanders who kept to themselves and didn't believe in spilling emotion all over the place. Christopher later described his upbringing simply, saying he had good parents, that they weren't the kind of family that was emotionally expressive, and that stoicism was the expected norm in their household. And by all appearances, Christopher Knight was an unremarkable young man navigating the early stages of an unremarkable life. But then, without warning, without a note, without a phone call or a goodbye, Christopher Knight abandoned his job, got into his car, and drove. He drifted south for a while, through the American interior, with no particular destination in mind, just moving. Then, just as abruptly, he turned the car north and headed back toward Maine. Some people later pointed out that Knight's departure coincided with the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in April 1986, and a state trooper noted that Knight remembered the event to help mark the date he left society. But Knight himself was clear that Chernobyl was not the reason he left. It was simply a convenient marker in time. The real reason, if there was one, remained something he could never fully articulate, not to the journalists who later sought him out, not to the psychologists who evaluated him, and perhaps not even to himself. When the car ran out of gas somewhere near the Belgrade Lakes region of central Maine, he simply left it on the side of the road, pocketed the keys, and walked into the forest. He left behind everything: his wallet, his identification, every tether to the world he was abandoning. He was 20 years old. He would not speak to another human being for the next 27 years. No one reported him missing. His parents, true to the family's emotional reserve, never contacted the police. His brothers assumed he had simply moved on. And Christopher Knight, for his part, seemed to vanish as completely as if the earth had swallowed him whole. What he did next was extraordinary, not because it was dramatic or violent or even particularly adventurous, but because it was so quietly total. He walked into the woods near North Pond in the small town of Rome, Maine, and he stayed. He didn't pitch a tent in the backcountry or camp along a riverbank. He found a cluster of massive glacial boulders, their surfaces covered in moss, surrounded by such dense vegetation that even someone standing a few feet away would have had no idea the space behind them existed. There, between those ancient stones, Knight built a camp out of nothing. Over the first few years, he moved locations several times out of caution, but by 1989, he had settled into this final spot and would not leave it for over 2 decades. He constructed a rudimentary shelter using tarps and materials he stole from nearby cabins. He had no fire, ever. He understood that the smoke and the smell of a campfire would betray his location. Even in the dead of a Maine winter, when temperatures plummeted well below zero and the snow piled in drifts around his camp, Knight never lit a flame. He survived the cold through sheer endurance and careful preparation, layering stolen clothing and sleeping bags, stockpiling food during the warmer months like a human squirrel, and timing his movements to the rhythms of the forest. He considered the moon to be the minute hand of his clock, and the seasons to be its hour hand. He didn't even know the name of the pond he lived near until after his arrest, nor the name of the nearest town. His world had shrunk to a radius of a few miles, a tiny kingdom of boulders and trees and stolen provisions. He later explained that the most dangerous time for him was winter, and that the stillness of the frozen forest was, paradoxically, what he cherished most. There were no animals rustling, no birds calling, no leaves moving, just silence. Pure, crystalline, total silence. And Knight lived inside that silence for 27 years. To survive, he stole. He committed over 1,000 burglaries during his time in the woods, averaging roughly 40 per year. He targeted seasonal cabins and summer camps, including Pine Tree Camp, a facility for children and adults with disabilities. The camp's facilities manager later said that Knight had used them as his personal store, and that the frustration was that they could not leave anything at the camp because everything was fair game to him. Knight took only what he needed: canned food, batteries, propane for cooking, clothing, books, and the occasional small amount of cash. He also took hundreds, perhaps thousands of books over the years, consuming literature voraciously in his camp by the light of a stolen headlamp. He never carried a weapon. He never harmed anyone. He was meticulous in his methods, choosing to break in only on dark, rainy nights when the sound of his movements would be masked by the storm. He learned the routines of every cabin owner in the area, knew when they would arrive and when they would leave, and he was so careful about covering his tracks that many of the people he robbed didn't even realize anything had been taken. They'd arrive at their cabin for the weekend and notice that the peanut butter was lower than they remembered, or that a few batteries were missing from the drawer, and they'd chalk it up to their own forgetfulness. But over time, the losses accumulated, and the people around North Pond began to suspect that something strange was happening. The robberies were too consistent, too selective, and too clean to be the work of ordinary thieves. Rumors spread through the small community that someone or something was living in the woods. They called this unseen figure the North Pond Hermit, and for years the hermit remained a kind of local legend, a ghost story whispered over campfires, a puzzle that no one could solve. Some people believed the hermit was real, others thought it was just a story, and all the while Christopher Knight sat in his camp between the boulders, reading by the light of a headlamp, listening to a stolen radio, and watching the seasons turn with no one to share them with. In all those years, he spoke exactly once. Sometime in the 1990s, a hiker passed near his camp on a lightly traveled trail. The hiker said hello. Knight said hello back. And that was it. One word, one exchange, in 27 years. When journalist Michael Finkel later asked Knight what had happened to his sense of identity over those decades of complete isolation, Knight offered one of the most haunting reflections on solitude ever recorded. He said that solitude had increased something valuable in him, his perception, but that when he turned that heightened perception inward, he lost his sense of self entirely. There was no audience, no one to perform for, no mirror of another person's gaze to reflect him back to himself. He described himself as completely free, But the cost of that freedom was the dissolution of the person who had sought it. Knight was finally captured on April 4th, 2013, by Game Warden Sergeant Terry Hughes, who had been hunting the hermit for years. Hughes was a law and order man to his core, methodical and relentless. He had worked with Pine Tree Camp to install hidden motion-activated cameras and surveillance sensors in the forest, equipment borrowed from Homeland Security, and when the alarm tripped in the middle of the night, he drove out and caught Knight in the act of stealing food and tools from the camp kitchen. When Hughes confronted him, Knight did not run. He did not resist. He simply stood there, a 47-year-old man in stolen clothes, blinking in the beam of a flashlight, and spoke his first full sentence in nearly 3 decades. Hughes later told journalist Michael Finkel that he had been prepared to hate the hermit, but when Knight led him back to his camp, through the dense undergrowth and between the massive boulders, and Hughes saw the extraordinary hidden compound that Knight had built and maintained for over 2 decades, he described it as possibly the most extraordinary thing he had ever witnessed. Here was a man who had lived entirely outside of society, committed over 1,000 felonies, and yet had never once harmed another person. Hughes found himself, against every instinct, feeling a measure of sympathy for the man he had just arrested. The transition to jail was agonizing for Knight. After 27 years of near total silence, the constant noise of other inmates, the fluorescent lights, the filth and clamor of institutional life tore at his senses. He was overwhelmed by the constant presence of other people after decades of controlling every aspect of his sensory environment. He told Finkel that looking at other people's faces was distressing because there was too much information there, too many signals to process, too much social data flooding a mind that had spent a generation in stillness. When 2 of his brothers, Joel and Tim, came to visit him in prison, Knight didn't recognize them. They had assumed he was dead for years. He looked at their faces through the glass partition and saw strangers. The encounter was emotional but profoundly strained, a reminder of how completely his isolation had severed him from every human connection he had once known. A forensic evaluation found no major psychological disorders, though Knight exhibited severe social anxiety and significant social impairment resulting from his prolonged isolation. Experts debated whether he was on the autism spectrum, but no formal diagnosis stuck. One autism researcher said simply that in the history of autism, there was no documented case of anyone surviving alone for that long while demonstrating such sophisticated planning and execution. Stephen Edelson, executive director of the Autism Research Institute, reviewed the case and offered a memorably dry assessment. He simply diagnosed Knight as a hermit. The honest answer was that Christopher Knight defied every category. He was sentenced to 7 months in jail, which he had largely already served while awaiting trial, and completed a co-occurring disorders court program designed for people with substance abuse and mental health challenges. During his October 2013 court appearance, he spoke in public for the first time in nearly 3 decades, offering a brief apology to his victims. He paid roughly $2,000 in restitution. As of the most recent reports, he lives a quiet life in a small Maine town, working at an auto shop with the help of his brother. He has given almost no interviews since his release. He never returned to the woods, and he continues to value his privacy above all else. A man who spent 27 years proving that the world could go on without him, and then had to learn, painfully, that he could not entirely go on without it. The dense jungles of the Philippine archipelago hold their own story of solitude, one very different from Knight's voluntary retreat. On December 26, 1944, a 22-year-old Japanese intelligence officer named Hiroo Onoda was sent to the small island of Lubang, about 90 miles southwest of Manila, with a mission that would consume the next 3 decades of his life. The Pacific War was nearing its catastrophic conclusion, and the Imperial Japanese Army was sending specially trained operatives to the farthest corners of its crumbling empire to conduct guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines. Onoda had been trained at the Nakano School, an elite intelligence academy in Tokyo, where he studied not just combat tactics, but philosophy, propaganda, martial arts, and covert operations. His commanders drilled into him a single, unbreakable directive. Under no circumstances was he to surrender, and under no circumstances was he to take his own life. Onoda arrived on Lubang with orders to destroy the island's airstrip and harbor pier before the Allies could use them, but the officers already stationed there outranked him and refused to let him carry out his mission. When American and Philippine forces captured the island in February 1945, most of the Japanese garrison was killed or captured. But Onoda and 3 other soldiers, Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, escaped into the island's mountainous interior and began doing exactly what Onoda had been trained to do. They waged a guerrilla war. The first leaflets announcing Japan's surrender arrived in October 1945. A separate group of Japanese holdouts on the island showed Onoda and his men a note left by villagers that read plainly that the war had ended on August 15th. But Onoda studied the leaflets and found what he believed to be errors, inconsistencies that convinced him the documents were Allied propaganda designed to trick them into surrendering. He reasoned that if the war had truly ended, they would not still be encountering gunfire from local patrols. And so the 4 men stayed in the jungle. Over the following years, the Japanese government made repeated efforts to reach them. In late 1945, surrender orders from General Tomoyuki Yamashita were dropped by air over Lubang. Onoda's group examined them and declared them forgeries. In 1952, letters from the soldiers' families, along with personal photographs, were airdropped onto the island. Onoda recalled later that he assumed his family was being coerced by an occupying force, that they were writing under duress to lure him out. Every piece of evidence that the war was over became, in Onoda's mind, further proof that the enemy's deception was growing more sophisticated. The group shrank. Akatsu separated from the others in September 1949 and surrendered to Philippine forces in March 1950. Onoda considered this an act of desertion, and it made him even more wary. In 1954, Shimada was killed in a shootout with a Philippine Army patrol that had stumbled upon the men during a training exercise. Now it was just Onoda and Kozuka, 2 men living in constant motion through the jungle, conducting raids on local farmers, burning their rice harvests, and occasionally exchanging gunfire with police and villagers. Over the course of their long campaign, as many as 30 Filipino civilians were killed. In October 1972, Kozuka was shot and killed by local police during one of their raids. Onoda was now completely alone. He was 50 years old and had been in the jungle for 28 years. For the next 2 years, he survived by himself, moving through the dense tropical undergrowth like a ghost, eating bananas, coconuts, and stolen rice, sleeping in caves and under tree canopies, always listening, always watching, always convinced that the war continued somewhere beyond the horizon. Then, in February 1974, a 24-year-old Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki arrived on Lubang Island. Suzuki was a free-spirited traveler who had told friends he was on a quest to find three things: a giant panda, the abominable snowman, and Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, in that order. Remarkably, after just 4 days of searching, Suzuki located Onoda in the jungle. The two men spoke, and Onoda, while moved by Suzuki's presence, still refused to surrender. He told Suzuki he would only leave if he received a direct order from his commanding officer. Suzuki returned to Japan with photographs of the encounter, and the Japanese government tracked down Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, Onoda's former commanding officer, who had long since left the military and become a bookseller. On March 9, 1974, Taniguchi flew to Lubang, hiked into the jungle with Suzuki, and stood before Onoda in uniform. He read aloud an official order that, in accordance with imperial command, all combat activity was to cease immediately and all personnel were to surrender to the nearest authorities. Onoda wept uncontrollably. He handed over his sword, his rifle, 500 rounds of ammunition, several hand grenades, and a dagger his mother had given him decades earlier. He was 52 years old. When Onoda returned to Japan, he was greeted as a national hero by a crowd of 8,000 people. His arrival was broadcast live on Japanese television. He wore his tattered imperial uniform and presented his sword to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, who formally pardoned him for the crimes committed during his decades-long guerrilla campaign. But the Japan that Onoda returned to was utterly unrecognizable. The devastated wartime nation he had left behind had transformed into an economic powerhouse, a modern, Western-influenced democracy that bore almost no resemblance to the empire he had fought for. Onoda struggled deeply with the transition. He perceived what he considered to be an erosion of traditional Japanese values, a population no longer devoted to the emperor, a culture he did not understand and could not relate to. Within a year, Onoda left Japan for Brazil, where he managed a cattle ranch in a Japanese immigrant community outside Sao Paulo. The contrast between the jungle of Lubang and the open grasslands of Brazil could not have been more stark. But Onoda seemed to find in ranching a kind of simplicity and physical purpose that modern Japan could not offer him. He married a woman named Machie Onuki, a tea ceremony teacher, and for years the couple lived between Brazil and Japan. In 1980, Onoda learned that a young man in Kanagawa Prefecture had murdered his parents with a baseball bat, and the news disturbed him so deeply that he decided to return to Japan permanently to teach children how to be strong enough to overcome their difficulties. In 1984, he established the Onoda Nature School, a survival skills program designed to teach resilience and self-reliance to Japanese youth, qualities he felt were disappearing from a society that had grown soft and complacent in the decades since the war. He remained a polarizing figure throughout his life, celebrated by some as a symbol of loyalty and endurance, embraced by Japan's conservative establishment as a reminder of traditional virtues, but condemned by others, particularly on Lubang Island, for the violence he and his companions inflicted on innocent Filipino civilians who had done nothing wrong except live on the island where Onoda chose to fight his phantom war. As many as 30 people died during those decades, and for the families of those victims, Onoda was no hero. He was a man who had killed their loved ones and been pardoned for it. Onoda died on January 16, 2014, in a Tokyo hospital at the age of 91 from pneumonia. 2 years before Onoda finally emerged from the Philippine jungle, another Japanese soldier's long vigil came to an end on a different Pacific island, under circumstances that were in some ways even more desperate. On the evening of January 24, 1972, two local hunters named Jesus Montanona Duenas and Manuel Tolentino de Gracia were checking their shrimp traps along a river in the Talafofo region of Guam when they noticed a hunched, disheveled man moving along the riverbank. At first, they assumed he was a local villager known for wandering the area. But as they drew closer, the man panicked, dropped a handmade net sack filled with shrimp traps, and charged at them, reaching for one of their rifles. In his weakened state, the 56-year-old man was no match for the two hunters. They subdued him, tied his hands, and brought him back to their home. The man's name was Shoichi Yokoi, and he had been hiding in the jungles of Guam for nearly 28 years. Yokoi was born on March 31, 1915, in Saori, Aichi Prefecture, Japan, into a family fractured by poverty and abandonment. His mother left his alcoholic father when Yokoi was just 3 months old, and the boy was passed from one reluctant relative to another throughout his childhood. At 15, he apprenticed himself to a master tailor in Toyohashi, about 40 miles from Nagoya, and the meticulous craftsmanship he learned in that trade would later prove essential to his survival. When Yokoi was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1941, he initially served with the 29th Infantry Division in Manchuria before being transferred to the 38th Regiment and deployed to Guam in February 1943. When American forces retook Guam in the bloody Battle of 1944, the Japanese garrison of roughly 20,000 men was nearly annihilated. Yokoi and about 9 other soldiers escaped into the island's dense interior, hiding in the jungle and refusing to surrender. The Bushido Code had been drilled into every Japanese soldier. Surrender was worse than death, a disgrace not only to the individual, but to his entire family. Rather than face that shame, Yokoi chose a life of hiding and deprivation that would stretch across nearly 3 decades. The group dwindled over the years. Some were captured, others died from disease or starvation, and eventually only 3 remained: Yokoi and 2 companions named Mikio Shichi and Satoshi Nakahata. The 3 men separated, but would visit each other periodically, sharing what meager food they could find and maintaining a fragile sense of human connection. Around 1964, Yokoi found both Shichi and Nakahata dead in their cave, lying side by side, likely victims of food poisoning. Yokoi later described the crushing loneliness that followed their deaths, saying that he felt deprived of every warmth from inside his heart, that he sat without eating or sleeping, overwhelmed by desperate loneliness. For the last 8 years before his discovery, he was entirely alone. Yokoi's survival was a testament to extraordinary ingenuity and iron discipline. He carved out a small underground shelter near the Talafofo River, roughly 3 feet by 6 feet, dug with a trowel he had fashioned from a fragment of an artillery shell. The cave was supported with bamboo and camouflaged with local vegetation, invisible to anyone who might pass above. He moved only at night, carefully erasing his footsteps as he went. Drawing on his training as a tailor, Yokoi made his own clothing from fibers he teased from wild hibiscus bark, spinning them into thread and weaving the thread into a rough burlap-like fabric. He sewed the garments together with needles he carved by hand and fastened them with buttons made from discarded plastic. He survived on a diet that would horrify most people: shrimp, eels, frogs, rats, toads, snails, river fish, mangoes, papayas, and coconuts. He knew the war was over. He had found leaflets in 1952 announcing Japan's surrender. But the shame of being captured alive was so deeply embedded in his psyche that he could not bring himself to emerge. He later explained simply that Japanese soldiers were told to prefer death to the disgrace of being captured alive. So he remained in his cave year after year, keeping busy to prevent his mind from dwelling on memories of his mother, on the home he had left behind, on the life that was passing him by above ground. When Yokoi was finally brought out of the jungle, he weighed less than 90 pounds and was mildly anemic from a lack of salt in his diet. But otherwise, he was in surprisingly decent health. He was repatriated to Japan in February 1972 and received a hero's welcome. More than 5,000 flag-waving people turned out to cheer him at the airport. But Yokoi's first words upon his return were not those of triumph. He said, with visible anguish, that it was with much embarrassment that he returned, reflecting the deep shame he carried for having survived when so many of his comrades had died. At the airport, he visited the grounds of the imperial palace and spoke to the emperor he had served, saying that he deeply regretted he could not serve him well, but that his determination to serve would never change. The world Yokoi returned to was entirely alien. He had left Japan in 1943 when it was a wartime empire driven by military discipline and imperial devotion. He returned in 1972 to a nation of bullet trains, television, and consumer culture. He had never watched a television broadcast, never heard of jet airplanes, knew nothing of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the moon landing, or the assassination of President Kennedy. Everything from the cars in the streets to the clothes on people's backs was incomprehensible to a man who had spent 28 years making his own garments from tree bark. The cultural disorientation was profound and at times overwhelming. He entered into an arranged marriage in November 1972 to a woman named Mihoko, and the adjustment was steep for both of them. When Yokoi volunteered to cook a pan of field mice shortly after they married, having eaten such things for years in the jungle, Mihoko told him firmly that she would handle all the cooking from then on. He attempted a run for parliament in 1974 unsuccessfully, and wrote a best-selling autobiography that captivated the Japanese public. He became a popular television personality and an advocate for simple living, but he never quite felt at home in modern society. He often criticized the innovations and materialism of contemporary Japan, nostalgic for a world that no longer existed and perhaps had never existed in the way he remembered it. He made several return trips to Guam, always drawn back to the jungle that had been both his prison and his sanctuary. Mihoko later recalled that her husband avoided talking about the war or his experiences on Guam, but she could see the toll they had taken. He had survived where thousands had perished, but survival had come at a cost that was invisible to everyone but him. Yokoi died of a heart attack on September 22, 1997, at the age of 82. An inscription on his family's gravestone had once recorded his death in Guam in the summer of 1944, and for almost 3 decades, the world had believed that was true. While soldiers like Onoda and Yokoi endured isolation measured in decades, the psychological damage of being truly alone can devastate the human mind in a fraction of that time. Sarah Shourd learned this in the most brutal way imaginable. In the summer of 2009, Shourd was a 31-year-old English teacher living in Damascus, Syria, with her boyfriend, journalist Shane Bauer. When their friend Josh Faddle came to visit from the United States, the three decided to take a vacation to Iraqi Kurdistan, a semi-autonomous region in northern Iraq that had developed a small but growing tourist industry. The mountains were green, the waterfalls were stunning, and no American had been killed or kidnapped in the region in recent years. It seemed safe enough. On July 31st, 2009, while hiking near a popular tourist site along the Iraq-Iran border, the three Americans were confronted by Iranian border guards who accused them of crossing into Iranian territory. Their families would later insist the crossing was accidental, that the border was poorly marked, and the hikers had no idea they had wandered into Iran. It didn't matter. The soldiers forced the three into a vehicle and drove them to Tehran, where they were blindfolded and taken to Evin prison, one of the most notorious detention facilities in the world. Evin had long been synonymous with political repression, torture, and execution. It was a place where the Iranian government held its enemies, real and imagined, and the three Americans were about to become political pawns in a geopolitical game they had never asked to play. All three were initially placed in solitary confinement, but after some time, Bauer and Faddle were moved into a shared cell. Shourd remained alone. She would stay in solitary confinement for the entirety of her imprisonment, a total of 410 days. Her cell was small, bare, and suffocating. A single window, high up near the ceiling and too far away to reach, was covered with bars and a perforated sheet of metal that reduced the outside world to tiny dots of light and faint sounds. The distant call of birds, the muffled rise and fall of the sun, the whisper of a breeze she could feel but never see. Those pinpricks of sky became her lifeline. They told her when morning came and when night fell. They allowed her to scratch marks into the wall to track the passage of days. Without them, she later said, she would have felt truly entombed. The psychological deterioration began after roughly 2 months. Shourd described how she would spend large portions of her day crouched on all fours beside a narrow slot at the bottom of her cell door, pressing her ear to the gap, listening desperately for any sound that might distract her from the terror of her isolation. She suffered from insomnia, nightmares, hallucinations, and a growing sense of emotional detachment, as if the person she had once been was fading away, becoming unreachable. She had violent panic attacks. More than once, she lost all control and began screaming, pounding the walls of her cell with her fists until her knuckles bled and the skin split open. She described the experience of solitary confinement in terms that bordered on the existential. She said it erased her, that it was like being buried alive, that she could not talk to anyone, could not laugh, could not have a personality, and that her world shrank smaller and smaller until everything she had known, everything she had loved, seemed impossibly far away. She would think about the person she had once been, the woman who had friends and a career and a life, and that woman felt like a stranger. She was never told her rights, never allowed to meet with a lawyer, and was not even permitted to make a phone call home until 6 months into her captivity. She was interrogated for the first 2 months, and the guards told her that solitary confinement was for her own safety, that there were no appropriate cellmates for her. But the supposed safety of isolation was its own form of destruction. She was never safe from her own mind. At one point during her captivity, she briefly communicated with another prisoner through an air vent, a human rights activist named Zahra Bahrami, a Dutch-Iranian woman who had been detained during political protests. Bahrami whispered through the vent that she had seen Shourd's mother on BBC television and that people were working for her release. She told Shourd to have hope. The two women spoke in hushed tones for about 2 weeks, making plans to meet in the Netherlands when they were both free, to dance and drink and celebrate their survival. That brief connection, those few whispered words through a wall, was almost like falling in love, Shourd later recalled. It was the most profound human contact she had in over a year. Zahra Bahrami was later executed by the Iranian government. After her wall-pounding breakdown, the guards began allowing Shourd to see Bauer and Fatal, first for half an hour per week, then half an hour per day, and eventually for an hour each day. Those visits, she said, were a huge part of how she maintained what remained of her sanity. But for the other 23 hours of each day, she was alone. She tried to keep her mind occupied by cycling through multiplication tables, by pacing her cell endlessly, by doing anything to avoid being still, because stillness meant the thoughts would come, and the thoughts were unbearable. Shourd was released in September 2010 after 410 days on $500,000 in bail brokered through the Swiss embassy, which represents American interests in Iran since the two countries severed diplomatic ties in 1979. The judge who authorized her release acknowledged that her time in solitary confinement had itself been a severe punishment. At first, Shourd refused to leave without Bauer and Fatal, but she realized she could be more effective advocating for their release from the outside. In her first week of freedom, she appeared on Oprah and met with President Obama, President Ahmadinejad, and Secretary Clinton, desperately lobbying for the release of the two men she had left behind. Bauer and Fatal were released a year later, in September 2011. Shourd and Bauer married in May 2012, their bond forged in the crucible of shared captivity. But the trauma lingered, poisoning everything it touched. Shourd struggled to make eye contact. Being touched made her flinch. Crowds overwhelmed her. She felt hardened, jaded, disconnected from the people who loved her. She later said that after 2 years of squashing her feelings, all those feelings came out, and it was terrifying to see what was there. She described how she nearly screamed the words, "Take cover," on a commercial airplane when the cabin lights flickered off, her body still trapped in the reflexes of a prisoner, even as her mind struggled to rejoin the world. Years of therapy were necessary before she could begin to feel anything close to normal. She said that the only thing harder than getting out of prison was getting prison out of you. She and Bauer eventually divorced in 2019, the long shadow of their shared ordeal perhaps finally proving too much to bear. Shourd became one of the most vocal advocates for ending the use of solitary confinement in American prisons, producing a play called The Box that drew on her own experience and the testimonies of over 75 American prisoners held in isolation. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture has declared prolonged solitary confinement, any period exceeding 15 days, to constitute torture, and Shourd's work has helped shape policy in California and beyond. She has pointed out with bitter irony that the United States keeps more people in solitary confinement than any other country in the world, including Iran. The open ocean is a kind of solitary confinement of its own, one without walls, but no less disorienting. In the summer of 1965, a quiet, middle-aged copy editor at the Cleveland Plain Dealer named Robert Manry decided to chase a dream he had been carrying since childhood. Manry was 47 years old, lived in a modest tract home in Willowick, Ohio, with his wife Virginia and their 2 children, Robin and Douglas. He worked the night shift at the newspaper, commuted home in the early morning hours, and by all appearances was precisely what he seemed to be, an ordinary suburban American man leading an ordinary suburban American life. But Manry had a secret. Since boyhood, when he had attended Woodstock School High in the Himalayan mountains of India, where his parents were Presbyterian missionaries, he had dreamed of sailing across the ocean. In 1964, a friend proposed that the two of them sail a 25-foot sloop across the Atlantic. But the friend backed out at the last minute, and Manry, rather than abandoning the dream, simply scaled it down. He owned a 13.5-foot sailboat he called Tinkerbell, a 30-year-old wooden Old Town whitecap that he had bought through a classified ad and painstakingly rebuilt in his spare time. He had added a small cabin, a daggerboard keel, running lights, a compass, and enough buoyant foam to keep the boat afloat even if it capsized. He told only his family. He knew that if anyone else learned what he was planning, they would try to stop him. On June 1st, 1965, the day before his 48th birthday, Manry departed from Falmouth, Massachusetts, bound for Falmouth, England, some 3,200 miles across the North Atlantic. He had shared his plans only with his family, and they had stocked the tiny boat with provisions as it sat tied up behind the Island Queen in Falmouth Harbor. His departure was deliberately quiet, without fanfare or announcement, because he knew that if his editors at the newspaper, or his neighbors, or anyone else in authority learned what he was planning, they would almost certainly try to stop him. A middle-aged copy editor with limited open ocean experience, setting out to cross the Atlantic alone in a boat smaller than most people's bathrooms, was not a plan that inspired confidence in others. But Manry had spent years preparing, replacing the centerboard with a daggerboard keel, installing a cabin, a cockpit, running lights, and a compass, and stuffing the hull with buoyant foam as a safeguard against capsizing. He packed antibiotics for illness, supplies to repair torn sails and broken hardware, even prepared for the possibility of emergency appendicitis. And he packed Dexedrine, amphetamine tablets that would allow him to stay awake for up to 20 hours during storms, or when favorable winds demanded he keep sailing. The boat was barely larger than a bathtub. The open ocean stretched before him like an infinite, featureless desert of water, and he was alone on it. For the first several weeks, the voyage was a private affair. Manry sailed, slept in snatches, ate canned food, and navigated by sextant and compass. He wrote in his logbook. He talked to himself. He watched the sea change color from green to gray to black as the depths beneath him plunged to 3 miles. The solitude was immense, not the sheltered silence of a forest or a cave, but the vast, exposed loneliness of a man sitting in a vessel, the size of a closet, in the middle of the most powerful body of water on Earth. There were no landmarks, no trees, no buildings, no other people. Just water in every direction, and the endless rolling of the waves. And then the hallucinations began. As the weeks wore on and sleep deprivation accumulated, exacerbated by Dexedrine tablets he took to stay awake during storms and favorable winds, Manry began to see and hear things that were not there. He described vivid encounters with a phantom hitchhiker who appeared in the boat and led him on a side trip to an island that did not exist. He saw figures in the water. He heard voices. The hallucinations, both visual and auditory, lasted for hours at a time before he would finally collapse from exhaustion and sleep, only to wake and find himself alone again with the sea. He was knocked overboard by broaching waves on multiple occasions, 6 times in total, and each time he had to haul himself back into the tiny boat, struggling against the current, his mind racing with thoughts of sharks and the 3-mile abyss beneath him. His rudder cracked in mid-ocean, and he had to repair it himself. He was woken one morning by a surfacing submarine, the USS Tench, which appeared alongside Tinkerbell like some enormous sea creature rising from the deep. He experienced moments of transcendent peace when the sea was calm and the sky was clear, and he felt a connection to something larger than himself, something that made the suffering worthwhile. And he experienced moments of abject terror when the waves were mountainous and the wind howled and the little boat was tossed like a toy, and he was convinced he would die. After 5 weeks at sea, a passing freighter stopped to collect his mail, and word of his voyage began to spread. Newspapers in Cleveland and across the country picked up the story, and by the time Manry approached the English coast, he had become an international sensation. On August 17, 1965, 78 days after his departure, Robert Manry sailed into Falmouth Harbor, England. He was 40 pounds underweight and sun-battered, but he was alive. An armada of over 300 small boats escorted him into port, and more than 50,000 people lined the quay to cheer his arrival. His wife and children, who had been flown in from Ohio, were there to greet him. Manry went down on all fours and kissed the ground. The story of Tinkerbell made Manry a celebrity. He wrote a best-selling book about the voyage, published in 1966 by Harper & Row, appeared on television programs around the world, and was celebrated as a modern-day Magellan. His feat was compared to Lindbergh's solo transatlantic flight of 1927, and for months he was feted at press conferences, parades, and parties on both sides of the Atlantic. The rivalry between Cleveland's two newspapers over who would break the story first became legendary in its own right, with a reporter from the rival Cleveland Press tracking Manry down in mid-ocean and scooping the plane dealer's own story about their own employee. But the man who returned from the sea was not quite the same man who had left. 78 days of near total isolation, of sleep deprivation and hallucination, and the constant threat of death had marked him. He had seen the edges of his own mind and found them more fragile than he had imagined. The sea had given him everything he had dreamed of, and it had taken something in return, some essential sense of safety, some basic trust that the world was solid and predictable, that could never quite be restored. Manry died of a heart attack on February 21, 1971, in Union City, Pennsylvania, at the age of just 52, barely 6 years after his historic voyage. A small park in Willowick, Ohio, the town where he had lived his quiet suburban life, was named in his honor. Tinkerbell herself is now on display at the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland, a tiny wooden boat just 13.5 feet long that somehow crossed an ocean carrying a man, his dream, and the weight of his own solitude. Far from the open Atlantic, in the mist-shrouded mountains of the Scottish Highlands, there is a deep freshwater loch called Loch Treig. In Gaelic, the name derives from a word meaning abandon, and locals have long called it the Lonely Loch. It is a striking body of water bordered by precipitous hills, accessible only by a long walk from the nearest road, and it is home to one of the most remarkable hermits of the modern age. Ken Smith was born on October 28, 1947, in a small village in Derbyshire, England. His childhood was marked by poverty, but he developed a deep and abiding love for the natural world that would shape the rest of his life. At 15, he left home to work for the Forestry Commission at Rannoch in Scotland, and later took better-paying work in construction. His life might have followed a conventional trajectory had it not been for a brutal, life-altering event. At the age of 26, Smith was attacked by a gang of thugs after a night out. The beating was savage. He suffered a brain hemorrhage that required 4 operations and 9 hours of surgery. He was in a coma for nearly 2 weeks. When he finally regained consciousness on his 27th birthday, a nurse told him that tomorrow would be his birthday, but that today was the day he was reborn. Smith took those words to heart. He resolved that if he was going to be born again, he would live on no one's terms but his own. The assault left him profoundly changed, not just physically, but philosophically. He developed a fierce need for independence, a determination to live outside the systems and structures that governed ordinary life. He traveled to Canada, where he spent years walking through the Yukon Territory, covering over 22,000 miles on foot, learning survival skills, and testing himself against the wilderness. It was an extraordinary odyssey, one that took him through some of the most remote and dangerous terrain on Earth. He encountered grizzly bears at close range, endured savage storms, and nearly died more than once. When Smith finally returned to England, he learned that both his mother and his father had died while he was away. The grief hit him with devastating force. He began walking the length of Britain from south to north, and as he walked, he wept. He cried through the lowlands and through the midlands and into the highlands, and he kept walking until he stopped crying. The place where the tears finally ceased was a wooded shore on the banks of Loch Treig, in the remote heart of Lochaber. He looked across the water, at the mountains and the mist and the silence, and he knew he had found his home. In 1986, with the permission of the local laird, Smith built a log cabin on the shore of the lonely loch. It was a 2-hour walk from the nearest road, nestled in the remote area of Lochaber, one of the wildest corners of the British Isles. There was no electricity, no running water, no gas. The cabin had a log fire for heat, and that was all. He named it Stag Inn, though the letter R had long since fallen off the sign, a fact that Smith considered a fitting metaphor for the gently sliding state of things. He grew his own vegetables, foraged for berries in the surrounding woodland, fished in the loch, and brewed his own beer and wine with an enthusiasm that bordered on the industrial. He reportedly stored over 80 gallons of homemade wine in anticipation of his own funeral, a detail that perfectly captured his dry, self-deprecating humor. He cooked on a log fire and fashioned a compostable waste system he called the bottomless pit. Once a month, he rose at 4 a.m, hiked 3 hours to the nearest railway station, endured an hour-long train journey to Fort William, and filled a 70-liter rucksack with provisions and medical supplies that would sustain him for the following weeks. It was a 54-mile round trip just to post a letter. Smith was a meticulous diarist. Over the course of his decades at Loch Treig, he filled journals with observations about the weather, the wildlife, the changing seasons, and the small daily details of a life lived in profound simplicity. More than 2 million words, according to those who have worked with his diaries, a vast record of one man's solitary existence at the edge of the inhabitable world. He also photographed his surroundings obsessively, creating a visual archive of a landscape that few others ever saw. The solitude did not drive Smith mad, at least not in any clinical sense. Unlike Christopher Knight, who severed all human contact, Smith maintained relationships with family and friends through letters and occasional visits, and he welcomed the rare hiker or curious stranger who found their way to his cabin. He owned a radio for weather forecasts and to listen to old symphonies, a wristwatch, a few cameras to help him remember things, and the GPS beacon that would later save his life. He was not trying to be the most off-grid person alive, and he resisted any attempt to romanticize his lifestyle into something purer or more philosophical than it was. He described himself not as a hermit, but as the tramp of Treig, an ordinary bloke who had simply made different choices. But his life was fundamentally a solitary one, and the decades of living alone shaped him in ways that are difficult for most people to fully comprehend. He spoke about his connection to the land with a reverence that bordered on the spiritual. He said that if you love the land, it sort of loves you back, and that it loves you back in all the things it produces for you. He dismissed the modern world with gentle contempt, saying that he found it weird that people spent their lives working to buy a lot of things they didn't need, and that the happiness he felt every day in his cabin was something most people could only access for a week of vacation a year, visiting a place like his. In 2019, Smith's solitary life was nearly ended by a stroke. A friend had recently given him a GPS personal locator beacon, and Smith activated the SOS function just days after receiving it. The signal was picked up by a response center in Houston, Texas, which relayed it to Scottish emergency services. A helicopter was dispatched to the Lonely Loch, and Smith was airlifted to a hospital in Fort William. He recovered, though with residual memory and vision problems, and returned to Treig as soon as he was able. A year later, he was hospitalized again after a pile of logs collapsed on him, once more activating his emergency beacon to summon help. Despite these health crises, he had no intention of leaving. His story gained wider attention through a BBC Scotland documentary, The Hermit of Treig, filmed over 10 years by director Lizzie Mackenzie, and a memoir, The Way of the Hermit, published in 2023 and co-written with Will Millard. In both, Smith emerged as a figure of warmth, humor, and unexpected wisdom, a man who had chosen a life that most people would consider unbearable, and who insisted, with quiet conviction, that it was the best life he could have lived. He described himself not as a guru or a philosopher, but as an ordinary bloke who simply followed the voice inside him that said there had to be a better way to live than what the modern world was offering. There is something that connects all of these stories, from the Boulder camp in Maine to the jungles of the Philippines and Guam, from the cells of Evin prison to the rolling swells of the Atlantic, to the misty banks of a lonely Scottish loch. Each of these people was stripped down to the most fundamental question of human existence. Who are you when there is no one else around to tell you? Some found a kind of peace in the answer. Others found only terror, and some, like all of us, found both. If these stories stayed with you, and if you want to hear more like them, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button below. It helps more than you know. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.